Good morning, everyone. Over the past few days, a flotilla of Russian Navy ships has been sailing in the vicinity of the North American continent. I want to be clear that this Russian flotilla presents no immediate threat to Canada or Canadians. However, in order to monitor and track the movements of the flotilla, we worked very closely in cooperation with the United States and have deployed a number of Canadian naval vessels, including the Ville de Quebec and CP-140 patrol aircraft. Now, on the advice of the Canadian Armed Forces, I authorized the Canadian Margaret Brooke to sail into Havana, where it arrived on Friday. The Canadian ship visited Havana to demonstrate Canada's presence, naval capability, and commitment to safe and open waters in the Americas. And if I may be very clear, this was a direct result of a request that was made to me by the Commander of Joint Operations Command and the Admiral in charge of the Royal Canadian Navy. The port visit was carefully planned at Canada's request, and it was announced by the military in advance. Today, the Margaret Brooke will begin its journey back to Canada. The deployment of these ships and aircraft sends a very clear message that Canada has a capable and deployable military, and we will not hesitate to do what is required to protect our national interests. Canada will and is committed to maintaining a credible military presence in the sea and in the air around our continent. And any foreign actors coming into our neighborhood can expect to see our armed forces fulfilling their mission to protect Canada's interests. The Canadian Armed Forces will continue to track the movements and activities of the Russian ships. Presence is part of deterrence, and we will continue to conduct regular operations in support of our continental defense mission in cooperation with our closest ally, the United States. Our armed forces members have done an outstanding work to fulfill their duties in defending North America, and I'd like to thank them for having the watch. And with our new investments in maritime sensors, naval sustainment, and early warning aircraft through RNOR Strong and Free, we're going to continue to do what is required to keep Canada and North America safe in the years to come, and I'll be happy now to take any questions that you may have.
Did you know that the Russians would be in Havana at the same time when you requested that invitation for the Margaret Brooke? So when was that you made that request to be invited to Havana?
And again, the request was actually made by Canada through the Royal Canadian Navy. The invitation was accepted by Cuba, and we were aware that the Russians would be there at the same time.
But given that you were aware of that, should the trip have been postponed?
No.
Why not?
It is our job to ensure that the Navy does what is required to establish Canada's presence, naval capability, and commitment to safe and open waterways. From the very first moment that those Russian vessels entered into the Atlantic and began their journey down the eastern seaboard, Canada and the United States worked collaboratively together in order to track the movement of those ships. And as they entered into Cuban waters, we were able to continue into the Havana harbor. That was part of the job.
Minister, France wants to see Western countries to put some trainers back on the ground inside Ukrainian territory, where, of course, Canadian forces used to be there on a training mission.
Yep.
Do you imagine any scenario in which Canada would get on board with that and send trainers back in right now?
Yeah, thanks very much. I just came back from NATO. We had a number of discussions about ways in which we can continue to support Ukraine. There was discussion of a NATO mission to enhance the training. At the present time, the circumstances are not right to deploy, in my view, the Canadian trainers in Ukraine. However, should the conditions change, we are open to that. But right now, we are going to continue to train them in Poland, in Latvia, in the United Kingdom, and in Canada. And so we have already trained over 40,000 Ukrainian Armed Forces members. That work goes on with our allies. We work very much in partner with all of them. We'll find the best way to continue to deliver that training to Ukraine to fulfill its needs.
What about the circumstances?
Understand that why exactly the conditions aren't there for us to go in there and do the training?
I think, first of all, I want to make sure that that training is effective for the Ukrainian Armed Forces. We also want to make sure that any members that we deploy into Ukraine would be able to do their job safely. There is, I think, quite an understandable concern about expanding a training mission into Ukraine at the current time. However, there has been very strong collaboration among all of the allies looking at the best ways to deliver that training. One of the challenges that we find is there needs to be a coordination of effort Right now, NATO is proposing that there be a significant enhancement of the SAGU, which is a group which will take on NATO responsibilities to coordinate that training from Wiesbaden, and we're doing it in a number of important areas. That training has been very effective, but there are some challenges that Ukraine has identified to us, and we're working really hard to meet those challenges.
Just on the Cuban situation, is it, given that Cuba is collaborating with the Russians in the war against Ukraine, is it a good time for Canada to send its ships to the area, to Cuba? Like, why would we do that?
Based on the advice I received from the Commander of Joint Operations Command and the Royal Canadian Navy, it was exactly the right time for us to be in Havana.
Wait.
Why did the CAF want to go there?
And again, I'm not going to get into the reasons.
It's giving you advice. They're saying this is why we should do it.
Yeah,
And what did they say?
and certain aspects of the information they shared with me is classified, and I'm certainly not going to share it here. I can tell you that the request came from the Commander of the Joint Operations Command and the Royal Canadian Navy. They asked, and on their behalf, we asked if they could go in to that harbor. They were doing their job, and as I've said, their job is to demonstrate our presence, to demonstrate our naval capability, and to demonstrate and assert Canada's commitment to safe and open waters throughout the Americas. That's why we were there.
But what kind of a message does it send to do that, you know?
Well, it depends on how you interpret it. If you look at it only through a partisan political lens, as some have done, I think you can get yourself very confused about what the purpose of it there. I've been able to be clear that this was a military mission. This was a mission that was articulated by the Commander of Joint Operations Command and the Royal Canadian Navy. They asked for my authority to do that, and I gave it.
Your visits, the Canadian Navy didn't visit Cuba since the Cuban Revolution until your government came to power. Then Prime Minister Trudeau went to Cuba in 2016. 3 days later, the Fredericton went down there, right after he had called Cuba an ally at the University of Havana. And we've seen another visit in 2018, and now a third visit. The other visits were not to track Russians. Why is the Canadian Navy going to Cuba at all? And particularly now, in light of the fact there are Cubans fighting in Ukraine, and they've opened a base in
And to
Belarus.
be really clear, one of the responsibilities of the Royal Canadian Navy is to visit ports around the world. We are asserting our presence in the Indo-Pacific region, throughout the Atlantic, and certainly in the CARICOM area. As a matter of fact, the Margaret Brooke, that is currently visiting Havana, has been very active in the CARICOM, in the Caribbean Sea, performing part of Operation Carib, where they've been interdicting narcotics that are moving through the region. There's a very good reason for us to be there. And the Navy articulated a requirement and asked if they could deploy their ship into the Havana Harbor. Based on their request and the information they provided, I approved it.
Is Canada an ally? Do you consider them to be an ally?
No, I do not. But we have allies through NATO, and we have other nations that we maintain working relationships. Certainly in the CARICOM region, there are a number of island nations that we maintain relations in the region because we have a job to do there.
Reassessing your relationship with Cuba in light of their cooperation with Russia and Ukraine, and reopening Russian spy base at Lourdes, opening a base in Belarus, inviting Russian warships. Are you reassessing it?
And I will leave that assessment to our global affairs and the Minister of Global Affairs. I'm the Minister of National Defense. I am working with our military to protect our interests, to, as I've said, demonstrate our presence, our naval capability, and our commitment to safe and open waterways throughout the world, and certainly throughout the Americas. And that's my job, and that's what we're doing.
Well, shouldn't she have been aware then that this visit was happening? Because she went on live television and said, this is news to me.
Well, and again, this was a military mission. That's what the request had come from the Joint Operations Command and from the Navy, asking for authority that I possess under the National Defense Act to deploy their resources into that location, and that's the basis of the approval.
I'm just trying to understand, you're saying that Canada is an ally to Cuba, and I'm just trying to understand for people at home, like, so why again are we doing this? Like, if we're not allies, like, why couldn't we just postpone this?
There are ports and navies around the world that Canada works hard to maintain a working relationship with. And so we visit ports all over the world. I was recently in Singapore, and our ships were in the Indo-Pac region and visiting Malaysia and other countries in the region. That's an important part of the mission of the Canadian Armed Forces and the Royal Canadian Navy to do those deployments In these circumstances, as I've already said, we were monitoring very carefully and very closely the passage of Russian naval ships and submarines along our eastern seaboard, around the Florida Panhandle and down towards Cuba. Canada and the United States were doing that together.
Do you regret it?
Not in the least. It's the job. It's our job to be there, to be present, to demonstrate our commitment to the freedom of waterways in the Americas, to demonstrate Canada's capability, and to establish a presence. And as I've said, presence can be a deterrent.
So was this a mission to gather intelligence on the Russians?
And again, I'm not going to comment on any aspect of the mission, only that they were there on a military, as a result of a request from the military, and it was under that authority that I approved it.
But how could the Margaret Brooke be a deterrent? It's just a coastal patrol vessel. The Admiral Gorshkov is a
And
missile.
again, Evan, I'll go right back to a statement I've already made. Presence is deterrence. We were present.
On the NATO defense ministers meeting, discussions about the $40 billion long-term commitment to Ukraine. Where do we stand on that? Are we willing to put up more money into that commitment annually for Ukraine?
Actually, a very robust discussion that took place in Brussels with respect to the proposal of NATO to establish $40 billion a year fund in order to support Ukraine. All of us were taking that information back to our respective governments. I strongly suspect it'll be part of a very important discussion that will take place at the Washington summit, the NATO summit, that'll take place in the second week in July.
Will we have a decision by then, do you think, about what we'll be doing?
Well, again, I think that's up to the heads of state that will be attending that meeting. I'll be there as well. But NATO has, I think, articulated a strong plan going forward, and that will be the subject of consideration and discussion when we get to Washington. Thank you all very much.